I discovered that someone had been stealing my hot water during the coldest snap Minnesota had seen in 20 years, when I noticed my utility bill had tripled, and my basement pipes were making sounds like a dying accordion. My name is Quentin Walker, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, for exactly 8 months when this nightmare began. I had moved there from Chicago after landing a remote position with a tech company, thinking that suburban life would be peaceful and uncomplicated. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a finished basement, and I had been thrilled to find something affordable so close to the Twin Cities. What I did not know was that the homeowners association, led by a woman named Brenda Patterson, would make my life a living hell. It started in mid-January 2025, right when the polar vortex decided to park itself over the upper Midwest. Temperatures had plunged to negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills making it feel like negative 50. Schools were closed, businesses were operating on skeleton crews, and the news kept warning everyone to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. I had stocked up on groceries, made sure my furnace was working properly, and settled in to ride out the freeze from the comfort of my home office. That was when I noticed the first problem. I had gotten up around 6 in the morning to make coffee, and when I turned on the kitchen faucet, the water that came out was barely lukewarm. I figured maybe the cold weather was affecting the water heater somehow, so I went down to the basement to check it out. The water heater looked fine, the pilot light was on, and the temperature gauge showed it was set to 130 degrees like it should be. I scratched my head, made a mental note to keep an eye on it, and went back upstairs. Over the next few days, the problem got worse. Not only was the hot water lukewarm at best, but I was also hearing these strange knocking and whistling sounds coming from the pipes in the basement. It sounded like water was rushing through them at odd hours, especially late at night when I was not using any water at all. I would be lying in bed trying to sleep, and I would hear this distinct whooshing noise followed by a series of clanks and groans. At first, I thought maybe it was just the pipes contracting and expanding with the temperature changes, but something about it felt off. On the 4th day of the cold snap, I received my utility bill in the mail, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. My natural gas bill, which had been running around $80 a month, had jumped to $247. My water bill had also increased significantly, nearly doubling from the previous month. I sat at my kitchen table staring at those numbers, trying to figure out what could possibly explain such a dramatic increase. I had not been using more water or heat than usual. If anything, I had been more conservative because of the extreme cold and the news reports about stressed utility systems. I called the utility company that afternoon, and after waiting on hold for 35 minutes, I finally got through to a customer service representative named Tom. I explained the situation, and he pulled up my account on his computer. "Yeah, I am seeing the spike here," Tom said, his voice crackling slightly through the phone line. "Your usage for the past week has been about 3 times your normal rate. Have you had any guests staying with you? Maybe doing a lot of laundry or taking long showers?" "No, it has just been me," I replied, feeling frustrated. "And I am not doing anything differently. Actually, I have barely been using hot water because it comes out lukewarm anyway." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Lukewarm. That is strange. If you are using that much gas, your water should be scalding hot. You might have a leak somewhere, or maybe your water heater is malfunctioning. I would recommend calling a plumber to check it out." I thanked him and hung up, then immediately started searching for local plumbers who could come out during the freeze. Most were booked solid with emergency calls for burst pipes, but I finally found a guy named Dave Kowalski who said he could squeeze me in late that afternoon. His rate was higher than normal because of the weather and the high demand, but at this point, I did not care. I needed to figure out what was going on before my next utility bill bankrupted me. Dave showed up around 4:30 in the afternoon, a burly man in his 50s with a thick gray beard and kind eyes. He stomped the snow off his boots in my entryway and followed me down to the basement. I showed him the water heater and explained all the symptoms: the lukewarm water, the strange noises, the skyrocketing bills. He spent about 20 minutes examining the water heater itself, checking valves, testing the thermostat, and inspecting all the connections. "The water heater looks fine," he said finally, straightening up and rubbing his lower back. "But let me check your pipes. Sometimes in this kind of cold, you can get weird pressure issues or even ice blockages that cause strange behavior." He started following the pipes from the water heater, tracing them along the ceiling of the basement. I followed behind him, watching as he examined each joint and section carefully. We had made it about halfway across the basement when he stopped abruptly and pointed up at the ceiling. "What the hell is that?" he asked. I looked up and saw what he was pointing at. There, near the exterior wall of the basement, was a section of copper pipe that looked newer than the rest. The soldering was cleaner, shinier, and the pipe itself had a slightly different color than the aged copper around it. But what really caught my attention was the fact that this pipe seemed to disappear into the wall, heading in a direction that made no sense for my house's plumbing layout. "I have no idea," I said slowly. "I did not have any plumbing work done. That was not there when I moved in, or at least I do not think it was." Dave pulled out a small flashlight and examined the connection more closely. "This is a tap," he said, his voice grim. "Someone has deliberately connected into your hot water line here. See how this pipe branches off? It is not going to any fixture in your house. It is going through that wall." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean, someone tapped into my line? Who would do that?" "I do not know, but we need to figure out where this pipe goes." Dave pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "This is illegal as hell. You are essentially supplying hot water to someone else and they are not paying for it. That explains your high bills and your lukewarm water. Someone is literally stealing your hot water." I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest. "Can we trace where it goes? Let me see." Dave moved along the wall, tapping on it and listening carefully. "Sounds like it goes into the crawl space behind this wall. Do you have access to that area?" I nodded and led him to a small access door in the corner of the basement. We had to move some storage boxes out of the way, but we finally got the door open. Dave shined his flashlight into the dark crawl space, and I peered over his shoulder. The beam of light followed the copper pipe as it snaked through the cramped area, eventually disappearing into what looked like a hole that had been drilled through the foundation wall. "Son of a bitch," Dave muttered. "That pipe is going outside your house." "It is going somewhere else in the neighborhood." "Can we follow it from outside?" I asked, my mind racing. Dave looked at me and then at the window where we could see snow blowing past in the fading daylight. "In this weather, it will be tough, but we can try. Let me get my gear from the truck." We bundled up in our warmest clothes and headed outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow, making my eyes water and my lungs ache. Dave had brought a small shovel and a metal detector that he said could sometimes pick up copper pipes under shallow snow. We made our way around to the side of my house, where the basement wall was located, and started carefully digging through the snow. It took us about 20 minutes of cold, miserable work, but we finally found it. The copper pipe emerged from my foundation and ran underground for about 15 feet, before surfacing again near the property line between my yard and my neighbor's yard. From there, it ran along the ground, covered by landscaping rocks and partially buried, until it reached the exterior wall of the house next door. "That is the old Henderson place," I said, staring at the house. "But nobody lives there right now. It has been empty since I moved in." Dave shook his head. "The pipe is going into the basement. Someone has access to that house, and they have been using your hot water. In this kind of weather, they are probably running it constantly to keep their pipes from freezing." "But who? And why would they tap into my line instead of just using the utilities at that house?" "Maybe the utilities are shut off there," Dave suggested. "Or maybe someone is trying to save money at your expense. Either way, this is theft, and it is also incredibly dangerous. If that pipe froze and burst, it could flood both properties. You need to call the police and report this." I pulled out my phone with numb fingers and dialed 911. The dispatcher said they would send an officer out, but it might take a while because they were dealing with multiple emergencies related to the weather. I told her it was urgent, that someone had illegally tapped into my plumbing, and she said she would mark it as a high priority. Dave and I went back inside to warm up while we waited. He showed me the pictures he had taken and explained that I would need to have the illegal tap removed and the pipe properly sealed. He estimated it would cost around $800 for the repair work, plus whatever damages I had already incurred from the theft. "You should document everything," Dave advised. "Take your own pictures, save all your utility bills, and get a written statement from me about what we found. If you decide to take legal action against whoever did this, you will need evidence." The police officer, a young woman named Officer Martinez, arrived about 45 minutes later. I explained the entire situation, showed her the tap in my basement and the pipe running to the neighboring property, and gave her copies of my utility bills. She took extensive notes and photos of her own. "This is definitely theft of services," Officer Martinez said. "And the property damage from the unauthorized modification to your plumbing could be charged as criminal mischief. The problem is, we need to figure out who did this and who has been using the water. You said the house next door is vacant, as far as I know," I replied. "I have never seen anyone over there. Let me run the address and see who owns it." She went out to her patrol car and spent several minutes on her computer. When she came back, her expression was troubled. "The property is owned by Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. It was foreclosed on about 2 years ago, and the HOA took possession of it." Something clicked in my mind. "Wait, the HOA owns that house. Who has access to it?" "That would be something you would need to take up with your HOA board," Officer Martinez said. "But given what we have found here, I am going to request a warrant to enter the property and investigate. In the meantime, I would recommend having that illegal tap shut off and capped immediately. You should not have to keep paying for someone else's water usage." After Officer Martinez left, Dave got to work shutting off the illegal connection. He had to cut the pipe, cap it properly, and then seal the hole in my foundation wall. The work took another 2 hours, and by the time he was done, it was past 8 o'clock at night. He charged me $750 for the emergency call and the repair work, and I paid him without complaint. He had found the problem and fixed it, which was more than worth the cost. That night, I lay in bed trying to process everything that had happened. Someone from the HOA had deliberately tapped into my water line and had been stealing my hot water for who knows how long. The timing suggested they had done it specifically because of the cold weather, probably to keep the pipes from freezing in the vacant house next door. But that did not make it any less illegal or wrong. They had been making me pay for their water and heat without my knowledge or consent. The next morning, I decided to go straight to the source. I looked up the HOA board members on the community website and found that the president was Brenda Patterson, who lived just 3 houses down from me. I had met her briefly when I first moved in, and she had struck me as the kind of busybody who thrived on having power over others. She had made a point of going over all the community rules with me, emphasizing things like lawn maintenance schedules, acceptable paint colors, and noise restrictions. I had nodded politely and made my escape as quickly as possible. I walked down to her house around 9 in the morning and rang the doorbell. Brenda answered wearing a pink fleece bathrobe and holding a mug of coffee. She was in her early 50s with short blonde hair and the kind of pinched expression that suggested she spent most of her time finding fault with things. "Quentin, what a surprise," she said, not sounding surprised or pleased. "What can I do for you?" "We need to talk about the house next to mine," I said, keeping my voice level. "The one the HOA owns." Her expression immediately became guarded. "What about it?" "Someone tapped into my hot water line and ran a pipe to that house. I discovered it yesterday when I was investigating why my utility bills had tripled. I had a plumber out, and we traced the illegal connection. The police have been notified, and they are getting a warrant to enter the property." Brenda's face went through several interesting color changes, from white to pink to an angry red. "That is ridiculous. The HOA would never do something like that." "The house is owned by the HOA," I continued, "and someone with access to that property installed the tap. It is not something that could be done without keys and knowledge of where the pipes are located, so either you did it, or you know who did." "I do not appreciate your accusations," Brenda snapped. "If there is some kind of plumbing issue, that is between you and your plumber. Do not come to my house making wild claims about the HOA. Wild claims. I have pictures, a police report, and utility bills showing 3 times my normal usage. This is theft, Brenda. And if the HOA is responsible, you are going to be liable for my damages, the repair costs, and probably criminal charges." "Get off my property," she said, starting to close the door. "And if you continue to harass me, I will report you to the police." I left, feeling both angry and vindicated. Her reaction had confirmed my suspicions. She knew exactly what had been done, and she was panicking now that it had been discovered. Over the next 2 days, things escalated quickly. Officer Martinez called to tell me that they had executed the warrant on the vacant house. Inside, they found space heaters running in multiple rooms, all of them plugged in and working. More importantly, they found that the hot water line from my house was connected to a heating loop that had been installed to keep the pipes warm. It was a crude but effective system, and it had been using my water and gas to heat the entire plumbing system of the vacant house. We also found keys to the property on the key ring of Brenda Patterson, Officer Martinez told me. She is the HOA president, and she admitted that she authorized the connection to prevent the pipes from freezing. She claims she did not think it was a big deal and that she planned to reimburse you eventually. "That is garbage," I said. "She had no right to tap into my plumbing without my permission, and she certainly did not plan to reimburse me, or she would have asked first." "I agree," Officer Martinez said. "We are charging her with theft of services and criminal mischief. The district attorney will decide whether to pursue additional charges. In the meantime, you should consider filing a civil suit to recover your damages." I thanked her and immediately called a lawyer. I found an attorney named Richard Caldwell who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. I met with him that afternoon and explained everything that had happened. He listened carefully, reviewed all my documentation, and nodded thoughtfully. "You have a very strong case," Richard said. "Not only did they commit theft, but they also trespassed on your property by drilling through your foundation and installing the tap without permission. You can sue for the cost of your inflated utility bills, the repair costs, punitive damages, and potentially your legal fees. I would estimate your total damages are in the range of $5,000 to $10,000, possibly more depending on how long this was going on before you noticed. How long do you think it could have been happening? I asked. Let me look at your utility bills. Richard spread them out on his desk and started examining them month by month. Here, look at this. Your bills were normal in August, September, and October when you first moved in. But starting in November, there is a noticeable uptick. It is not as dramatic as January, but it is definitely higher than your baseline. I think they installed this tap sometime in late October or early November, probably when the weather first started getting cold. I did some quick math in my head. So they could have been stealing from me for nearly 3 months, at least. And during that time, you probably paid an extra $100 to $150 per month on top of your normal bills. Add that to the extreme usage in January, plus the repair costs, and you are looking at close to $1,500 in direct costs. But we can also argue for punitive damages because this was intentional and malicious. A judge might award you 3 to 5 times your actual damages. Let me do it, I said without hesitation. I want them to pay for what they did. Richard filed the lawsuit the following week. He named Brenda Patterson personally, as well as the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association as an entity. The suit detailed everything that had happened, included all the evidence and documentation, and demanded $15,000 in damages plus legal fees. The response from the HOA was swift and predictable. They hired their own lawyer, a man named Gregory Holmes who had a reputation for defending HOAs in disputes with homeowners. He immediately filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the case should be handled through the HOA's internal dispute resolution process rather than the courts. Richard shot that down quickly, pointing out that theft and property damage were criminal matters that exceeded the scope of internal HOA procedures. The local news got wind of the story, and suddenly, I was fielding calls from reporters who wanted to interview me. I agreed to talk to a reporter from the local NBC affiliate, and they came out to film a segment at my house. The story aired 2 days later, and it painted Brenda and the HOA in a very unfavorable light. They showed the illegal tap in my basement, interviewed Dave the plumber about the dangers of unauthorized modifications, and included Officer Martinez explaining the criminal charges. The segment ended with the anchor saying something like, "A local homeowner is fighting back after discovering his HOA was literally stealing his hot water during the worst cold snap in years." The case raises important questions about HOA oversight and accountability. After the story aired, I started getting calls and messages from other homeowners in the subdivision. Several people said they had noticed unusual increases in their utility bills, but had not thought much of it. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Patricia Hughes who lived 2 doors down from me, said her bills had been creeping up since the fall. "You think they might have tapped into my lines too?" Patricia asked when she came over to talk to me in person. She was a sweet woman in her late 60s with gray hair and worried eyes. "It is possible," I said. "You should have a plumber check your basement and trace your pipes. If you find anything suspicious, document it and call the police." Patricia hired a plumber the next day, and sure enough, they found an illegal tap in her basement as well. Her hot water line had been connected to a different vacant property on the next street over, another foreclosure that the HOA had taken possession of. She immediately filed a police report and contacted Richard about joining the lawsuit. Over the next week, 3 more homeowners came forward with similar discoveries. In total, the HOA had been tapping into 5 different houses to provide heat and water to vacant properties they owned. It was a systematic scheme, carefully planned and executed. Brenda had identified homes that were adjacent to or near vacant properties and had arranged for the illegal taps to be installed, probably by hiring some unlicensed handyman who did not ask questions. The criminal case against Brenda moved forward quickly. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Karen Holbrook, decided to prosecute aggressively because of the scope of the scheme. Brenda was charged with 5 counts of theft of services, 5 counts of criminal mischief, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. If convicted on all counts, she could face up to 3 years in prison and significant fines. Brenda tried to claim that she had only been trying to protect the HOA's properties from freeze damage, and that she had not meant to harm anyone. But that defense fell apart when prosecutors showed that she had never disclosed the taps to the affected homeowners, had never offered to reimburse them, and had actively tried to cover up the scheme when it was discovered. The fact that she had lied to me when I first confronted her, telling me the HOA would never do such a thing, was particularly damaging. The civil case was consolidated into a class action lawsuit representing all 5 affected homeowners. Richard estimated that our combined damages, including inflated utility bills, repair costs, and the decreased property values from the illegal modifications, totaled around $65,000. We were seeking that amount plus an additional $150,000 in punitive damages, plus legal fees. The HOA's insurance company tried to settle early, offering $50,000 to make the whole thing go away. Richard advised us to reject it, saying we could get much more if we went to trial. He was confident that a jury would be sympathetic to homeowners who had been victimized by their own HOA, especially given the criminal charges against Brenda. The trial was scheduled for late April 2025, about 3 months after I first discovered the tap in my basement. In the meantime, life in Meadowbrook Heights became increasingly uncomfortable. The community was divided between people who supported us and people who thought we were making too big a deal out of what Brenda called a simple mistake. Several board members resigned in the wake of the scandal, and the HOA struggled to function without leadership. I received a couple of threatening letters from anonymous neighbors telling me to drop the lawsuit and stop making trouble. One letter said I was going to bankrupt the HOA and cause everyone's dues to increase. Another said I should move out of the neighborhood if I could not be a team player. I turned both letters over to the police and to Richard, who added them to our evidence file. Patricia, on the other hand, received much worse treatment. Someone spray-painted the word snitch on her garage door, and her mailbox was knocked over twice. She was elderly and lived alone, and the harassment really upset her. I made a point of checking on her regularly and even installed a security camera pointed at her driveway, which I paid for myself. The camera caught a teenager from 3 streets over vandalizing her mailbox, and his parents were forced to pay for repairs and apologize. As the trial date approached, the HOA's legal position became increasingly desperate. Their lawyer tried several tactics to delay or derail the case, but Judge Michael Brennan, who was presiding, was not having any of it. He had reviewed all the evidence and seemed genuinely appalled by what had happened. "This is not a case of a neighbor borrowing a cup of sugar," Judge Brennan said during one pre-trial hearing. "This is systematic theft, property damage, and a fundamental violation of trust. The fact that it was perpetrated by a homeowners association, an entity that is supposed to protect and serve its members, makes it even more egregious. This case will proceed to trial as scheduled. The criminal trial for Brenda Patterson happened first, in early April. I attended every day, sitting in the courtroom and watching as prosecutors laid out their case. They showed pictures of the illegal taps, called Dave and the other plumbers as expert witnesses, and presented utility bills showing the dramatic increases in usage. They also called Officer Martinez, who testified about finding the space heaters and heating loops in the vacant properties. Brenda's defense attorney tried to paint her as a well-meaning volunteer who had made a mistake in judgment. He argued that she had been trying to prevent costly freeze damage to HOA properties and had not realized the impact on individual homeowners. But that narrative crumbled when prosecutors introduced emails that had been subpoenaed from Brenda's personal account. In those emails, which dated back to October 2024, Brenda had discussed the plan with two other HOA board members. One email explicitly said, "We can tap into the nearby houses to keep the pipes warm. The owners will never notice, and even if they do, we can just claim it was for emergency purposes." Another email discussed which houses would be the best targets, specifically mentioning that my house and Patricia's house were good choices because we were both new to the neighborhood and unlikely to cause trouble. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Brenda's sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, but the conviction effectively ended her role in the community. She resigned from the HOA board immediately, and her husband, a quiet man named Robert who had always seemed embarrassed by his wife's behavior, put their house up for sale. The civil trial began 2 weeks after the criminal conviction, and it was much shorter. With Brenda already convicted, the facts of the case were essentially settled. The only question was how much we should be awarded in damages. Richard called each of the 5 affected homeowners to testify about the impact of the theft. I described discovering the tap, dealing with the stress of the investigation, and the feeling of violation that came from knowing someone had been stealing from me. Patricia broke down in tears when she described the harassment she had endured, and the jury seemed visibly moved. We also called an expert in property valuation, who testified that the illegal modifications had decreased our home values by an average of 5%. People shopping for homes would be wary of buying in a neighborhood where the HOA had engaged in such conduct, and the stigma would last for years. For my house, which had been worth about $300,000, that represented a $15,000 loss in value. The HOA's defense was essentially non-existent. Their attorney argued that the HOA had limited funds, and that a large judgment would force them to levy special assessments on all homeowners, effectively punishing innocent people. Richard countered by pointing out that the HOA had insurance specifically for this type of liability, and that individual homeowners should not be shielded from the consequences of having elected corrupt leadership. Judge Brennan instructed the jury on the law and sent them out to deliberate. They came back the next afternoon with a verdict. We were awarded $235,000 in total, broken down as follows: $65,000 in compensatory damages for our actual costs and losses, $150,000 in punitive damages, and $20,000 in legal fees. My share, as the first person to discover the scheme and one of the most heavily impacted victims, came to about $75,000. I sat in the courtroom feeling a mixture of relief and vindication as Judge Brennan read the verdict. Brenda, who had been required to attend, sat stone-faced at the defense table. Her husband was not with her, and I later heard that he had filed for divorce and moved out of state. The HOA's insurance company paid the judgment within 30 days, as required by the court order. I received a check for $75,000, which felt surreal after everything that had happened. Patricia received a similar amount, and the other 3 homeowners split the remainder based on their individual damages. Brenda's criminal sentencing happened in late May. Judge Sarah Williams, who had presided over the criminal trial, sentenced her to 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the 5 affected homeowners, though that was largely symbolic since the civil judgment had already compensated us. Brenda was taken into custody immediately and transported to the women's prison in Shakopee, Minnesota. In the aftermath of everything, Meadowbrook Heights went through a complete overhaul. A special election was held to replace the entire HOA board, and the new members were committed to transparency and accountability. They hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations and implemented strict oversight procedures to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. The vacant properties that had been involved in the scheme were sold off to private buyers, with the proceeds going into the HOA's reserve fund. My neighbor's house, the one that had been heated with my stolen hot water, was purchased by a young couple with 2 kids. They were horrified when I told them the history, but they got a good deal on the price and seemed like nice people. Patricia and I became good friends through the ordeal. She started hosting a weekly coffee gathering at her house for some of the neighbors, and it became a nice way to rebuild the sense of community that had been damaged by the scandal. We made a point of being open about what had happened and encouraging other homeowners to stay vigilant about their rights. I used some of my settlement money to upgrade my home security system and to make some improvements to my basement, including installing a new water heater with better monitoring capabilities. I also set up automatic alerts through my utility company so I would be notified immediately if my usage spiked unexpectedly. The rest of the money went into savings, a nice cushion that I had not expected to have. The whole experience taught me some valuable lessons about homeowners associations and the importance of oversight. HOAs exist to maintain property values and enforce community standards, but they can also become vehicles for petty tyrants who abuse their power. Brenda had viewed herself as acting in the best interests of the association, but what she had really done was commit crimes against the very people she was supposed to serve. I also learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. When I first discovered the tap and confronted Brenda, I could have let her intimidate me into backing down. I could have paid the inflated bills and chalked it up to the cost of homeownership. But by pushing forward, documenting everything, and refusing to accept her excuses, I had not only protected myself, but also uncovered a much larger scheme that was harming my neighbors. The media attention around the case sparked a broader conversation about HOA accountability in Minnesota. The state legislature held hearings on HOA governance, and several new laws were proposed to increase transparency and give homeowners more recourse when disputes arose. I was invited to testify before a legislative committee, which was both intimidating and gratifying. I told them about my experience and urged them to pass strong protections for homeowners. One of the proposed laws would have required HOAs to carry liability insurance and to undergo annual audits by independent accountants. Another would have created a state ombudsman's office specifically for handling HOA complaints. Both measures faced opposition from HOA industry groups, who argued they would be too costly and burdensome. As of the time I am telling this story, the legislation is still pending, but I am hopeful it will pass eventually. In June 2025, about 5 months after I first discovered the illegal tap, I received a letter in the mail from the Minnesota Attorney General's office. They had launched an investigation into HOA practices across the state and wanted to interview me as part of their research. I agreed, and I spent an afternoon talking to an investigator about my experience. She told me that they had received dozens of complaints about HOAs engaging in various forms of misconduct, from misappropriating funds to discriminatory enforcement of rules. Your case was particularly egregious, the investigator, whose name was Linda, told me. But it is part of a larger pattern of HOAs overstepping their authority and taking advantage of homeowners. We are hoping to use cases like yours to push for stronger regulations and enforcement. I also heard from homeowners in other states who had read about my case and wanted advice. A man in Colorado contacted me after discovering that his HOA had been billing him for landscaping services that were never performed. A woman in Florida said her HOA had been foreclosing on homes for minor violations and selling them to board members at below-market prices. Each story reinforced my belief that HOA reform was desperately needed. My own life gradually returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. I continued working from home, taking advantage of Minnesota's beautiful summers and bracing myself for the winters. The polar vortex that had triggered this whole mess eventually moved on, and by February the temperatures had returned to more typical levels. My utility bills went back to normal, and I took a certain satisfaction in knowing that every dollar I was paying was actually for services I was using. The young couple who bought the house next door, Jason and Emily, turned out to be wonderful neighbors. Jason worked as an engineer for 3M, and Emily was a nurse at a hospital in Minneapolis. Their kids, a boy and a girl aged 6 and 8, would sometimes play in my yard, and I did not mind at all. It was nice to have signs of life next door instead of a vacant property. One evening in July, Jason came over with a 6-pack of beer and asked if we could talk. We sat on my back deck as the sun set, drinking beer and watching fireflies appear in the twilight. He asked me about the whole saga with the HOA, and I told him the full story. He listened intently, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "That is insane," he said when I finished. "We almost did not buy the house when we heard about what happened." But our realtor convinced us that it was a one-time thing and that the new HOA board was solid. "I think they are," I agreed. "The whole community learned a hard lesson. I do not think anyone wants to go through something like that again. Still, it is crazy that your own HOA would do that to you. They are supposed to be on your side." Jason took a sip of his beer and stared out at the darkening yard. "Emily and I have been to a couple of HOA meetings since we moved in, and everyone seems really focused on following the rules now. Like, maybe too focused. They spent 20 minutes arguing about whether garage doors should be white or beige." I laughed. "Yeah, that sounds about right. HOAs tend to swing between extremes. Either they are not doing their job at all or they are micromanaging every little detail. Finding the right balance is hard." We talked for another hour, discussing everything from local schools to the best places to get pizza in the area. It felt good to have a normal conversation with a neighbor, the kind of casual interaction that makes a place feel like home. For the first time since I had moved to Meadowbrook Heights, I felt like I actually belonged there. In August, I got an email from Richard Caldwell, my attorney. He had received a request from a publisher who wanted to write a book about HOA abuses and wanted to include my story as a case study. They were offering a small amount of money for the rights to use my name and the details of the case. Richard said it was up to me, but he thought it might be worthwhile to get the story out to a broader audience. I thought about it for a few days, and then agreed. If my experience could help other people understand the potential for HOA abuse and encourage them to stay vigilant, it was worth any potential awkwardness or publicity. The publisher sent a ghostwriter to interview me, and we spent several hours going over everything that had happened. The book was published the following year, and my chapter was titled, "When Your HOA Becomes Your Enemy." Brenda served her full 18 months in prison, getting released in late 2026. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Wisconsin after her release and that her ex-husband had gotten remarried. I never saw her again, and I was perfectly fine with that. Some people never take responsibility for their actions, and I suspected Brenda was one of them. She probably still believed she had done nothing wrong, that she had just been unlucky enough to get caught. The other HOA board members who had been involved in the scheme, the ones who had exchanged emails with Brenda, were never criminally charged. The prosecutor did not think there was enough evidence to prove they had direct knowledge of the illegal taps, though the emails certainly suggested they knew something shady was going on. However, they were named as co-defendants in the civil suit, and they paid additional settlements out of their own pockets. Those payments were not publicized, but Richard told me they were substantial enough to hurt. Looking back on the whole experience, I still get angry sometimes when I think about what happened. The violation of having my property modified without my knowledge, the theft of my money, the attempt to cover it up, all of it still stings. But I also feel proud of how I handled it. I did not roll over. I did not accept the excuses or the attempts at intimidation. I stood my ground, gathered evidence, and fought back through the legal system. And ultimately, I won. The settlement money was nice, but the real victory was holding Brenda and the HOA accountable for what they did. They learned that actions have consequences, and that homeowners are not just passive subjects to be exploited. We have rights, and we have the power to enforce those rights when necessary. I also gained something unexpected from the whole ordeal, a sense of connection to my community and a belief that individuals can make a difference. Before this happened, I had been a pretty passive resident, paying my dues and keeping to myself. Now I attend HOA meetings regularly, I vote in board elections, and I stay informed about what is happening in the neighborhood. I have encouraged other homeowners to do the same, and there is a much more engaged and active membership now. Patricia, who became one of my closest friends, passed away peacefully in her sleep in early 2027. She was 74 years old, and her family said she had been in declining health for several months. I attended her funeral and spoke about how brave she had been in standing up to the HOA despite the harassment. Her grandchildren thanked me afterward, saying that she had often talked about our friendship and how much it had meant to her. I was honored to have known her. In the spring of 2027, I decided to run for the HOA board myself. Several neighbors had been encouraging me to do it, saying that my experience made me the perfect person to help guide the association forward. I was reluctant at first, not wanting to deal with the politics and the time commitment. But ultimately, I felt a sense of obligation. If I had learned anything from my battle with Brenda, it was that good people need to step up and take responsibility, or bad people will fill the vacuum. I won a seat on the board easily, running unopposed. My first act was to propose a formal policy prohibiting any modifications to homeowner properties without written consent. The policy passed unanimously, along with several other transparency measures. We also established a whistleblower hotline for homeowners to report suspected misconduct anonymously, with protections against retaliation. Serving on the HOA board turned out to be more rewarding than I expected. Yes, there were tedious meetings about landscaping contracts and paint colors, but there was also the satisfaction of knowing I was helping to protect my neighbors from the kind of abuse I had experienced. We worked hard to rebuild trust in the association, and slowly but surely, the community healed. My house, which I had bought as a temporary landing place while I figured out my next move, became my permanent home. I grew to love Eden Prairie and the Twin Cities area. The winters were brutal, no doubt about that, but the summers were gorgeous, and the people were generally kind and down to earth. I made friends, found my favorite coffee shops and restaurants, and started to feel genuinely rooted in the place. The heated water line tap that started this whole saga became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents would hear the story and come by to see where it had happened, treating my basement like some kind of historical site. I would show them the spot where the illegal pipe had been connected, now properly sealed and painted over, and tell them the abbreviated version of what had transpired. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder to stay vigilant and stand up for your rights. In the end, what began as a shocking discovery during a brutal Minnesota winter turned into a transformative experience that changed not just my life, but my entire community. The HOA had tried to take advantage of me, assuming I would never notice or never care enough to fight back. They were wrong on both counts. I noticed, I cared, and I fought. And when the dust settled, justice was served, money was paid, and important lessons were learned by everyone involved. The whole mess cost the HOA and Brenda dearly, both in dollars and in reputation, while I walked away with compensation, vindication, and the knowledge that I had done the right thing. Years later, when people ask me about living in an HOA community, I tell them it can be fine as long as you stay informed and engaged. I also tell them about what happened to me, about the illegal tap and the theft and the legal battle that followed. Most people are shocked, unable to believe that an HOA would do something so brazen and illegal. But it happened, and it could happen to anyone who is not paying attention. The key is to know your rights, document everything, and never be afraid to stand up to people who abuse their power, even if they are your neighbors or the leaders of your community association. Because in the end, your home is your castle, and nobody has the right to violate it, steal from you, or treat you as a resource to be exploited. Not even your HOA.